Hi, welcome to Knit with Hannah. I'm Hannah. I'm here today to talk about knitting jargon. Hi, welcome to Knit with Hannah. I'm Hannah. I'm here with Knitting Natter to help you learn to knit the easy way. Let's make it easy, shall we? Knitting jargon can be annoying. Because we use words in knitting that we might have used somewhere else in our lives, and maybe we need to start to understand them better in the new context. So it feels like a new language in some ways, but it's words that we've used before. If you're new here, do subscribe and hit the little notifications bell because you have a video every week. I'm here every Tuesday and I talk about all sorts of things about knitting. You just go and have a look at my channel page. You'll see how many playlists there are, how many videos there are now. They're there to help you whenever you're knitting. So go and have a look at the channel page, go and look at all of those videos and do subscribe so that you know that you can come back anytime you like. So let's look at the first word we're going to think about today, and that is knitting. Knitting can be used in so many contexts because it's not just the hobby is called knitting. It's when you sit on the sofa and you are knitting, and when you have a bag full of your knitting. It's the needles, it's the yarn, it's what's sitting there and you're making a fabric up yourself now. That is called knitting. So it can be confusing because it's used in so many ways just within the hobby. Knitting is knitting is knitting is knitting. There you go. That's it. Let's just call it that and be proud. I'm a knitter. The second word we talk about is stitches. And stitches we know as something that you sew. Most probably you came across sewing stitches first, or you came across stitches if you had a cut and the doctor had to sew you up. So they are sewing stitches as well. In knitting, a stitch is a loop on a needle, and every loop on the needle is called a stitch. And then you can also look at the fabric you've made and identify the individual stitches that were on your needle, say 10 minutes ago. It's sitting there in the fabric now. That is an individual stitch. Think of it as ingredients make up the whole recipe and stitches make up the whole fabric. We have the stitches, but what if you have a whole needle full of them? Well, that is called a row of stitches. And you've got them all sitting on your needles. When you start knitting and someone says you need to knit 3 rows, it means that you have to knit across all of those stitches once, twice, 3 times, so that you've knitted 1, 2, 3 rows. That's what it means. A row is a group of stitches all sitting on the needle at the same time. And what about pattern? You might think of pattern as stripes or polka dots. But in this context, we are talking about what you might think of as a recipe. It's a set of instructions that make up a specific item. Once you've followed the pattern, once you've followed all of the instructions, you've finished knitting a specific thing. So for example, on my knitting pattern shop, there are lots of patterns for hats. You will buy a pattern. You will follow the pattern with the yarn and with the needles. You go through all of the instructions, and at the end of that, you will have a hat. That is what a pattern is for. It's like a recipe for knitting. Yeah, it's again something that you use in a different context. You have patterns in different respects, but in this respect, in this context, a knitting pattern is like a recipe. It's a set of instructions all grouped together for one item. And then there comes jargon that doesn't quite work in different cultures because knitting has grown up in so many different places. Stitches we call the same thing, rows we call the same thing, patterns we call the same thing, and obviously everywhere it's called knitting. But it's different descriptions for different parts of the pattern have grown up in different places. For example, in the UK, when you put stitches on the needle at the very beginning of a project, we call it casting on. That's fine. A lot of countries you call it casting on as well. But when you've finished knitting and you need to take the stitches off of the needle, we call that casting off. Kind of makes sense, casting on and casting off, boom. But if you live in the United States, then you won't call it casting off, you're more likely to call it binding off. Because you're creating a bound set of stitches, they're all stuck together, and you can remove them from the needle without the worry of them unraveling. So yeah, we call it do different things, but ultimately we're doing exactly the same thing. And this can happen in various things as well. For example, there is a particular stitch pattern that we use in the UK, and it's where you alternate between knit stitches and purl stitches. We call that moss stitch. And in the United States, it's called seed stitch. It's exactly the same thing. If you see the patterns, they are identical. The recipe, the instructions look identical, but we just call them different things. So one more thing we need to think about with knitting jargon is the abbreviations. And that's what a lot of people mean when they say knitting jargon. It is, hang on a minute, those 5 letters mean something and I got no idea what. So you just put that into YouTube with knitting next to it and you look it up and you find a video to explain it for you. And yes, I've got lots of these videos coming up in the next few weeks, so keep your eye out. But knitting jargon can be confusing, just the way it is. So we need to get used to it and just enjoy it. It's really fun actually learning new bits of knitting jargon as you go through and as you extend your experience with the knitting journey. Great, thank you for joining me today. Do subscribe if you're not subscribed already and hit the little bell for notifications. I'd love to have you here every week. I'm here every Tuesday, every week with a new video, and that's going to happen all the way through 2019. Thanks for joining me. Bye for now. Happy knitting.